It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at the busy corner grocery store, a place where the hum of conversation mixed with the squeak of shopping carts and the occasional beeping of cash registers. Customers moved about, ticking items off their lists, while staff members worked diligently to keep everything running smoothly. Among the team was the store manager, a calm and composed professional in his mid-30s. Known for his warm smile and ability to diffuse any tense situation, he was respected by his staff and customers alike. As the lunch rush began to dwindle, the door chimed, signaling the entrance of a woman in her early 50s. She walked in briskly, dressed in designer clothes and carrying an air of entitlement that turned heads. Her loud voice and sharp demeanor demanded attention as she stopped in the middle of the produce section, glancing around like she was searching for something or someone. It wasn't long before her sharp tone cut through the store. "Excuse me. Is anyone going to help me here?" she barked, waving her hand impatiently. A young employee approached her, offering assistance, but it quickly became clear that wasn't what she was after. Her eyes scanned past him, landing instead on the store manager as he organized items on a nearby shelf. "You there?" she called out, her voice tinged with impatience. "You must be in charge." The manager straightened up, adjusting his name tag and walking over with the same calm demeanor he always carried. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he greeted her with a polite smile. "How can I help you today?" Her gaze narrowed as she sized him up, her lips pursing. "Are you the manager here?" "Yes, I am." "Is there something I can assist you with?" She folded her arms, her tone dripping with condescension. "I find that hard to believe. Aren't there any supervisors more experienced in handling issues like mine?" Her words hung in the air, and a few shoppers nearby glanced in their direction, sensing the tension. The manager remained poised, though the subtle insult wasn't lost on him. "I assure you, ma'am, I'm fully equipped to address any concerns you may have," he replied, keeping his voice steady and professional. But instead of explaining her issue, she began to raise her voice, launching into a list of complaints about the store, its organization, and even the staff. It wasn't the words themselves that caused the growing unease among those listening, it was the way she said them, laced with a subtle but unmistakable edge. "Maybe if this place hired people who actually knew what they were doing, we wouldn't have these problems," she huffed, her gaze pointedly landing back on the manager. "Do you even know how to handle customer service properly? Or did you just luck into this job?" The manager's smile faltered just slightly, but he didn't respond to her baiting. Instead, he listened patiently, letting her finish her tirade. When she finally paused, he spoke calmly. "I'm sorry to hear you've had a less than ideal experience. Let's see how we can fix this for you." But she wasn't done. She scoffed loudly, stepping closer. "Fix it? People like you are the reason things are so chaotic these days. Honestly, I doubt you're qualified to do anything more than stack shelves." The air grew heavier with each word. A few customers stood frozen in place, unsure of whether to intervene or simply walk away. The young employee who had first approached the woman shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between her and the manager. Still, the manager didn't lose his composure. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but still respectful, "I'm here to help. Please let me know how I can assist you." But she cut him off with a dramatic wave of her hand. "Don't bother. I'll just take my business somewhere else. Places like this clearly don't know how to cater to decent, hardworking customers." With that, she spun on her heel and began marching toward the exit. But before she could leave, a man in a sharp suit entered the store. He walked with confidence, exuding an air of authority. The moment he stepped through the door, his eyes locked onto the scene that had just unfolded. "Ah, just in time," the woman muttered under her breath, loud enough for others to hear. "Finally, someone who might actually know what they're doing around here." The suited man's gaze shifted to the store manager, and something passed between them, something unspoken but unmistakable. And as the woman stood there, waiting for what she clearly believed would be her vindication, the man said something that stopped everyone in their tracks. The woman's expression froze as the realization hit her like a wave. What he said next would change everything and leave the entire store stunned. The man in the suit took a few measured steps forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. He didn't rush, but his presence was commanding enough to quiet the room. The woman, still fuming, turned her attention to him, her eyes lighting up with expectation. Finally, someone who would see things her way, she thought. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the suited man said smoothly, his voice calm but carrying an edge of authority that had an immediate effect on the atmosphere in the store. "I overheard your conversation with our manager. I believe there's been some misunderstanding." She blinked, momentarily thrown off by his calmness. Her grip on her purse tightened, and her posture straightened as she prepared to unleash yet another round of complaints. "Misunderstanding? Oh, I don't think so. This store is a disaster. And I was just telling your, manager here exactly what's wrong with it." The man's lips twitched into a barely perceptible smile. "I see." His gaze shifted slightly to the manager standing beside him. "I believe we've got everything under control, don't we?" The manager nodded, still holding his composure. "Yes, sir. We're doing everything we can to address the situation." For a brief moment, the woman seemed to soften, as though the presence of the suited man had shifted the balance in her favor. She opened her mouth to respond, but the man raised his hand to stop her. "I'm afraid there's more to this than meets the eye," he continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You see, our store manager here is not just any employee. He's one of the top performers in the company. In fact, I've personally seen how dedicated he is to ensuring that every customer leaves satisfied." Her eyes widened slightly, and her expression shifted just a flicker, but it was enough to be noticed. The manager, standing silently beside the suited man, said nothing. But his calm demeanor was starting to unnerve her, because for the first time, she wasn't entirely certain she was in the right. "Top performer?" she echoed, disbelief creeping into her voice. "How can that be? Look at this place. It's a mess." The suited man's eyes narrowed, just a touch, and he leaned in slightly, his voice lowering as he spoke directly to her. "What if I told you the man you've been belittling is not just the store manager, but also someone you might recognize from a very different context? Someone whose achievements and background might just surprise you?" The woman faltered, the confidence that had been so apparent moments before starting to waver. I don't know what you mean," she said, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice now. "Well," the man said, his tone cool and measured, "it's not every day you encounter someone who's not only a skilled manager but also someone who has worked tirelessly in the corporate world and community leadership. Someone who has turned down offers from other companies because he believes in the integrity of this one." Her mouth opened and closed a few times, her mind struggling to process the shift in the narrative. "I don't believe it," she stammered. "You're just trying to make excuses for him. This is ridiculous." The man's smile was faint but knowing. "You might be surprised what people are capable of when they're given the opportunity." The tension in the store hung thick in the air. Customers who had been milling around, pretending not to watch, were now frozen in place, caught in the growing drama. The woman was no longer speaking as loudly, her voice more subdued. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. Still, she wasn't ready to back down. "I don't care who he is," she said, her words now less sure of themselves. "He should be doing more to fix things around here." The suited man didn't flinch. "Perhaps, ma'am, you should reconsider how you approach those around you. You never know who might be in a position to help you, someone who's far more influential than you realize." The words hit her like a punch, and for the first time, she felt the faintest stirring of unease. She glanced at the manager again, studying him as though seeing him for the first time. His calmness was unnerving now, and she realized, with some discomfort, that the dynamic had shifted. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the store's other shoppers and the faint hum of the refrigerators. Then, the man in the suit turned to the manager and gave him a brief nod. "You're doing great," he said quietly, as though to reassure him. The manager simply nodded in return, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a release of the tension that had been building all afternoon. It was clear that whatever had just transpired had resolved itself in ways the woman couldn't yet understand. But the real surprise was still to come. The suited man stepped away from the counter, his eyes now focused on the woman. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft but firm, "I think it's time we ended this conversation. If you would like to discuss this further, my office is always open. But I suggest you take a moment to reflect on what just happened here. The truth is, you've been mistaken about more than just the store's management." The woman blinked, confused. Her face flushed with embarrassment, her earlier bravado evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. But she was still unwilling to admit she'd been wrong. She opened her mouth to speak, but the suited man raised his hand one last time. "Let me be clear," he said, his tone now colder. "You're in the wrong, and you owe our manager an apology. Otherwise, I will be forced to reconsider your status as a customer of this store." She took a step back, her mouth agape as the weight of the situation began to sink in. The manager stood silently by his side, the quiet authority in his presence unmistakable now. It wasn't just the suit or the sharp words of the suited man, there was something about the store manager himself that made her feel small, insignificant in comparison. But the tension didn't end there. As the woman stood frozen in her tracks, the manager turned slowly and started walking toward the back of the store, his head held high. His steps were deliberate, measured like someone who had seen much more in his life than she could ever comprehend. The suited man looked at the woman one final time, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Think carefully about your next move, ma'am," he said. "Your perception of things might just be about to change forever." And with that, he turned and followed the manager, leaving the woman standing in the middle of the store, struggling to process the gravity of what had just happened. The woman stood motionless, her eyes following the manager and the suited man as they disappeared into the back of the store. A deep sense of confusion crept over her, and for a moment she wasn't sure whether to feel embarrassed, angry, or both. She had expected a simple confrontation, a quick argument where she would leave victorious, having proven her point. But now, it was as if she were trapped in a strange, surreal moment where everything she thought she knew about the situation was suddenly uncertain. Behind her, the rest of the store seemed to resume its usual hum, but the energy had shifted. People had noticed the scene, and whispers spread like wildfire among the customers. The young employee who had first approached her now avoided her gaze, busying himself with restocking a nearby shelf. A few others, too, seemed to glance her way, but none spoke to her directly. She took a shaky breath, the sting of her own words starting to settle in. It wasn't just that she had been dismissed by the suited man, it was the way the manager had handled the whole ordeal. There had been no visible reaction to her insults, no attempt to defend himself, or even argue. Instead, he had remained poised, almost indifferent to her attempts at confrontation. It made her feel small, like a child throwing a tantrum in front of a calm adult who simply didn't care to engage. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that nagging doubt that had begun to creep into her mind. What had the suited man meant when he hinted that there was more to the manager than she realized? His words had been cryptic, like a challenge to her own assumptions, and it had left her wondering, was she wrong about him? Was she wrong about everything? Her thoughts were interrupted when the door to the back of the store swung open. The suited man stepped out first, followed by the manager. Their conversation had clearly ended, but there was something in the air, something different about the way they moved, the way they held themselves. The suited man, still composed and collected, nodded at the manager and made his way toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet space. The manager, however, didn't leave. He lingered for a moment, looking back at the woman as though weighing something. He didn't say anything he didn't need to. But his gaze, steady and unblinking, made her feel like she was being judged by someone who had seen far more of the world than she had ever known. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some kind of defense, but the words caught in her throat. The sheer weight of the silence between them was too much. Instead, she stood there, the space between them widening with every second that passed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the manager broke the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it that she hadn't expected. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, ma'am," he said, the words more of a formality than an apology. "But I suggest we end this conversation here." The woman's face flushed. Was he brushing her off? Was that how this was going to end? End it? She scoffed, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "You can't just dismiss me like this. I'm a paying customer, and I demand." "You demand what?" The manager's question was simple, but it felt like a challenge. "The manager you just disrespected is more than you think. Watch your back." Her pulse quickened. Her first instinct was to brush it off, to call it nonsense. But the truth was, something about the way the manager had handled the situation, the way the suited man had looked at her, it was as if they both knew something she didn't. Something she wasn't supposed to know. She had the sinking feeling that she had just crossed a line, one she hadn't even seen until now. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. What could she possibly say? There was no denying the tension in her chest, the realization that she had just stepped into a much bigger story than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about customer service anymore. It was about power, influence, and something far more dangerous than she had originally thought. She put her phone away and turned toward the aisle where she had seen the manager earlier. He was nowhere in sight. The store felt eerily quiet now, as though it were holding its breath. She stepped forward, her mind racing. Was she really going to do this? Was she really going to go after him? She had already pushed him too far once. What would happen if she pushed him again? Her feet carried her, almost without thinking, toward the back of the store, where she had last seen him retreating. She told herself it was just to clarify things, to get some answers. But deep down, she knew there was more to it. She was looking for something, anything that could prove she was right, that she wasn't in the wrong. She had to prove it. As she neared the back door, she heard voices. She froze, pressing herself against the cool, concrete wall, trying to make out the words. It was the manager's voice, but there was someone else with him. She could feel the tension rising again, like the moment before a storm broke. "You sure she's ready?" a voice asked, low and deliberate. It was a man's voice, one she hadn't heard before, but there was something about it that sent a shiver down her spine. "She's not ready for this," the manager responded, his voice steady and calm. "But she doesn't have a choice. We need to make sure she understands who she's dealing with." The words hit her like a blow, a deep sense of realization settling over her. What was happening here? She had thought this was about a simple customer complaint, a case of poor service. But now, it was starting to feel like something much darker, much more complicated. They were talking about her, about what she had just started, and more importantly, about how she had unwittingly crossed into territory she didn't understand. She wanted to move, to walk away, but her legs felt frozen, as though the weight of their words had rooted her to the spot. Her breath quickened as she tried to process what she had just overheard. What did the manager mean when he said she didn't have a choice? And who was this other person, the one who seemed to be involved in whatever game they were playing? The voices continued, but she could no longer make out the words. Instead, she felt an overwhelming urge to act, to confront them both. She had to know what was going on. She couldn't leave without answers. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and stepped forward, the sound of her shoes echoing in the empty space. As she rounded the corner, her eyes locked on the manager and the suited man. They were both standing near a back office door, talking in hushed tones. The suited man glanced up, his sharp eyes meeting hers before the manager could turn around. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, when everything stopped. The air felt thick with anticipation, as though something monumental was about to happen. The manager finally turned, his expression unreadable. But it wasn't the expression that caught her attention, it was the look in his eyes. There was a quiet, almost eerie calm to them now, one that sent a wave of unease crashing through her. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Something wasn't right. There was more going on here than she could understand. She had walked into something she couldn't escape from. And now, there was no turning back. "Are you sure she's ready?" the suited man asked again, his eyes never leaving hers. The woman swallowed hard. She had no idea what was about to happen, but she knew one thing for sure: whatever it was coming. And it was too late to back out now. The suited man's question hung in the air like a weight, pulling every ounce of tension in the room to a breaking point. The woman's heart raced in her chest, her mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. She had expected another confrontation, another round of her demanding answers, but this felt different. The look in their eyes, the subtle shift in the air, it was as if she had walked into something far beyond her understanding. The manager's gaze flickered momentarily to the suited man, then back to her. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he took a small step toward her, his presence suddenly more imposing than she had ever seen before. There was an edge to his calm now, something that made her feel like she was standing at the precipice of something dangerous. The woman's breath hitched, and she could feel her palms begin to sweat. "Maybe you don't understand what you've gotten yourself into," the manager said slowly, his voice lower than before. For a second, she wondered if she had misheard him. Was he threatening her? She had faced off with people before, had won arguments and gotten her way more times than she could count. But something about the manager made her feel small, like she was standing in front of someone who had played games much larger than the petty squabbles she was used to. Before she could respond, the suited man stepped forward, his tone suddenly sharp. "You think this is just about some disrespect in a store? Think again." Her eyes darted between the two men. What did he mean? What was going on here? A chilling silence stretched between them, thickening the air, as if they were both waiting for something to unfold. And then, in a move so fast she barely saw it coming, the suited man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the counter toward her. The woman stared at it, her mind racing. The envelope was plain, but there was something about it that made her stomach twist. It wasn't just a regular document, she could sense it. She had no idea what was inside, but she knew it held the key to everything that was happening here. Every instinct told her not to open it, to walk away, but she couldn't. Curiosity gnawed at her. "Go ahead," the suited man said, his voice low and insistent. "Open it. But be careful. You might not like what you find inside." The words rang in her ears like a warning bell, but something deep inside pushed her to tear open the envelope. She hesitated only for a moment before pulling out the piece of paper inside. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words that were hastily scribbled on the page. They weren't typed, no neat fonts or professional language, just a hurried, messy scrawl that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. "It's not over. We know what you did. This is just the beginning." The woman blinked, her mind racing to process the meaning behind the cryptic message. What was this? Was it a threat? And what did we mean? Her pulse thudded in her ears as she looked up at the two men standing in front of her, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, everything around her seemed to blur. The store, the customers, the buzzing lights, it all faded as the weight of the words sank in. She had thought that the tension between her and the manager had been the biggest problem. She had assumed that once she got an apology or an explanation, things would go back to normal. But now she was in the middle of something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. She looked at the suited man, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The man's lips curled into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "I think you already know the answer to that question. You've seen the signs. You've felt the pull. This isn't about you anymore, it's about what comes next." A wave of confusion washed over her. What was he talking about? What was next? And why was the manager standing silently, watching all of this unfold without a word? She turned to him, her desperation spilling into her voice. "What's going on? What do you want from me?" The manager's expression remained unchanged. "We don't want anything from you," he said, his voice flat. "But you have something we need." The words hit her like a punch. "Something I need?" "Yes. Your involvement has been inevitable from the start. But now that you've found out too much, well, now we need to know if you're willing to go the distance." The woman felt the ground beneath her feet begin to shift, like she was standing on the edge of a cliff and didn't know which way to fall. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore. She wasn't just a customer angry at poor service. She had been drawn into something much bigger, something darker, and she had no idea what kind of role she was meant to play in it. Her eyes flickered between the two men. The suited man was calm, collected, while the manager remained a quiet enigma. They knew something she didn't, and they were letting her figure it out piece by piece. But the more she tried to piece it together, the more her head spun. She swallowed hard, her mind whirling with possibilities. What if the threats weren't just words? What if they had the power to do more than just intimidate her? What was it that they needed from her? The suited man stepped closer, his tone colder now. "Don't mistake this for a game. You've crossed the line. The question is, will you be able to handle the consequences?" His words echoed in her ears as she stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. The room felt smaller now, the tension thickening to a near suffocating level. She had no idea what was coming next, but whatever it was clear she was already too deep to back out now. The room seemed to close in on her, the air thick with the weight of the unknown. She could feel her heart racing as she stood there, clutching the envelope in her hand, her mind still reeling from the cryptic message inside. The suited man's words lingered in her ears, heavy and ominous. She had no idea what she had gotten herself into, but now she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't just some innocent bystander in this twisted game. She was a part of it. She turned to the manager, desperate for some kind of explanation. "What do you mean, something we need? What could I possibly have that you want?" The manager didn't move, his gaze unwavering, but something in his eyes flickered just for a moment. "You already have it," he said quietly, his voice colder now, almost detached. "You just don't know it yet." Her pulse quickened. What did he mean? What did she have? Her mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle scattered before her, and she began to realize that nothing about this situation had been random. It wasn't about a simple customer complaint. It wasn't about her disrespecting someone. It was about something much bigger, something connected to her, something that had been pulling at her for longer than she could remember. The suited man stepped forward, his expression darkening. "It's time," he said, his voice hard. "You need to decide where you stand. Are you with us or against us?" Before she could respond, there was a sharp sound from the back of the store, footsteps, fast and heavy, heading toward them. The woman's heart stopped in her chest as she turned toward the noise, her breath catching. The door burst open, and another figure emerged from the shadows, one she never expected to see. Her breath caught in her throat as the person stepped forward, a familiar face she hadn't seen in years. It was someone from her past, someone she thought she had left behind long ago. Her mind scrambled to catch up. What was he doing here? How was he involved in all of this? She didn't have time to ask questions as the man's eyes met hers, a knowing look passing between them. "You didn't think you were the only one, did you?" he said, his voice low, almost amused. The woman's world spun as the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The situation she thought she understood, the game she thought she had been dragged into, it was far bigger than she could have ever imagined. She wasn't just dealing with two men trying to intimidate her. She was caught in the middle of a much larger web, one that had been woven around her long before this day. The pieces were falling into place now, but it was too much to comprehend all at once. The suited man and the manager exchanged a brief glance, and for the first time, the woman saw something flicker in the manager's eyes. It wasn't just cold calculation anymore. It was something else, something darker, more dangerous. She wasn't sure what it meant, but it made her blood run cold. The new arrival stepped closer, his presence looming. "You're a pawn, just like the rest of us. You've been part of this all along. You've always been part of it." Her mind reeled, confusion and disbelief flooding her senses. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not." "You are." The suited man's voice cut through her words, sharp and final. "The moment you crossed that line, you became involved. You just didn't know it yet." The room seemed to close in again as the weight of their words settled over her. She had thought she was in control. She had thought she could confront them, demand answers, and walk away. But now, she realized that she had been a part of something far beyond her comprehension. Something that involved all of them and perhaps even more. As the seconds ticked by, she felt a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a much larger game, one that had been in motion long before this confrontation, and one that wasn't finished yet. She could walk away, pretend none of this had happened, but the truth was, there was no walking away. Not now. The man from her past stepped closer, his voice lowering as he spoke again. "You don't get to choose anymore. You're in this. And now you'll find out what happens next." The woman felt her breath catch, the tension in the room thickening until it was almost unbearable. She wanted to scream, to run, to lash out, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. She was already trapped. Then, without warning, the manager took a step forward, his eyes locked on hers. "This is where you decide. What kind of person are you going to be? Will you accept what's been given to you, or will you try to fight it? Either way, you'll have to live with the consequences." For the briefest of moments, everything seemed to freeze. The world outside the store felt distant, like it no longer mattered. The only thing that existed in that moment was the weight of their words, the unbearable tension that pulsed through the air. And then, just as quickly, the door slammed open again, but this time it wasn't a person stepping through. It was a sound, a loud, ringing siren that cut through the silence, sharp and deafening. In an instant, everything changed. The room erupted in chaos. The woman turned instinctively, her heart pounding. There was no time to think, no time to question. The siren blared louder, and in that moment, everything she thought she understood about this twisted game shattered. The manager's face twisted into something unreadable, his calm facade crumbling for just a second. The suited man looked furious, his jaw clenched as he turned to the man from her past. "What did you do?" he hissed. But the man simply smirked, his eyes glinting with something darker. You should have expected this. It was always part of the plan. The siren grew louder, the noise deafening, and the woman felt herself being pulled toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, she realized something she hadn't noticed before: a small device, blinking faintly in the corner of the room. She didn't know what it was, but it was clear now that whatever this was, it wasn't over. The game was still unfolding, and she was about to learn that the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. She turned, her heart sinking, realizing that the true twist wasn't just about her involvement. It was about who else had been watching and who would be coming for them all next. The siren's shrill cry echoed through the store, drowning out all rational thought. The woman's fingers trembled against the cold metal of the door handle as her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The urgency in the sound, the raw panic it sparked, was overwhelming. Something had changed, something irreversible. Whatever had been building between her and the two men was about to explode in a way she couldn't have predicted. She had thought she was in control of the situation, but now, it seemed like the game was bigger than she could ever grasp. The suited man's expression had shifted from calm to furious in an instant, and the manager's face, which had remained stoic throughout their tense exchange, now showed signs of stress. His lips were pressed into a tight line, and his eyes were darting around the room, calculating. "What did you do?" the suited man hissed at the person from her past, his voice low and menacing. The woman turned back to face the new arrival, her mind still trying to catch up with the gravity of the situation. The man hadn't changed much since she'd last seen him. He still had the same sharp, calculating eyes that had once been filled with affection and warmth when they were closer. But now, they seemed colder, distant, as though a part of him had died and been replaced by something darker. "Relax," the man said, his voice smooth and calm, almost as if he was in complete control of the situation. It was the only way. The suited man's nostrils flared as he took a step toward him. "The only way? You've complicated everything." The woman was standing at the edge of the chaos, uncertain of who to trust and what was real. Her world had been flipped upside down in the span of a few minutes, and she had no idea how to right it again. The strange connection between the men, the cryptic messages, the envelope, everything seemed to be part of a larger scheme, one that had been set in motion before she even knew what was happening. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice shaking. She had to know. She couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. The man from her past turned to her, his gaze softening, but there was a coldness there she hadn't seen before. "You're in the middle of something much bigger than you realize. You always have been." Her heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's happening here?" The suited man stepped forward, his frustration growing. "You really have no idea, do you? We've been watching you for months. Everything about you, your background, your movements, it all ties into a larger plan. And now, because of your interference, things are going to get messy." The woman felt as though the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. She had thought this was about one simple confrontation, one misunderstanding, but now it was clear that she had been swept up into something far larger than herself. It wasn't just about her actions anymore, it was about something much more complex, something that had been in motion for far longer than she could comprehend. The manager finally spoke, his voice surprisingly calm. "We didn't want it to escalate this way, but you've pushed us into a corner. The device you saw, the siren, it's only the beginning. Things are in motion now, and there's no going back." The woman's head spun as she tried to make sense of it all. "What device? What siren?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The suited man turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. "The siren was the signal to activate the plan. You've seen the signs, but now you'll understand the consequences. You were never meant to be involved in this, but you've forced our hand." Her mind raced, but there was no answer, no explanation that made sense. Everything was happening too quickly, and yet, It felt like she was only scratching the surface. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man from her past gave her a cold smile, his eyes gleaming with something dark. "That's the part you'll learn soon enough. You've already made your choice. It's too late to turn back." Suddenly, the door slammed open once again, and in walked two new figures. The woman's heart skipped a beat as she recognized them. They were people from her past, two individuals she never thought she would see again. Their appearance sent a ripple of shock through the room, and for a moment, everything stood still. One of the new arrivals stepped forward, a woman with sharp features and a confident air about her. She glanced around the room, sizing up everyone in it, before turning her attention to the woman standing near the door. "You've caused quite a stir," the woman said, her voice dripping with both amusement and something more sinister. "But now, it's time to pay the price." The suited man and the manager exchanged a glance, their tension palpable. The woman from her past said nothing, his gaze fixed on the new arrival, but the tension between them was clear. "We weren't expecting you," the manager said finally, his voice tight. The new woman smiled, almost as if she were amused by his discomfort. "Well, you should have been. Things have changed, and now it's time for the truth to come out." The woman's mind was spinning, trying to keep up with the whirlwind of people and events unfolding in front of her. It was clear now that she was no longer just an innocent bystander. She was part of something much bigger, a tangled web that connected people from her past with forces beyond her understanding. But before she could process any further, the woman's gaze fell on something in the corner of the room, a small, flickering light. Her eyes narrowed. It was a device, a small but powerful object that was buzzing with energy, its presence seemingly unnoticed by everyone else. She recognized it immediately. This was the device that had triggered the siren. The one that had caused the chaos. The woman took a step toward it, her hand instinctively reaching for it, but before she could make contact, the suited man lunged toward her, grabbing her arm. "No! Don't touch it!" But it was too late. The moment her fingers brushed the surface of the device, a jolt of electricity surged through her body, sending her crashing to the floor. Pain shot through her limbs, and for a moment, everything went black. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on the cold floor, her body aching. The room was eerily quiet, the siren's wail gone, replaced by a heavy silence. She tried to sit up, but the world was spinning. The woman from her past was the first to speak. "It's over," she said quietly. "The plan failed. Everything we've worked for is done." The suited man looked around, his face a mask of frustration. "We lost," he muttered, his voice filled with defeat. "Everything we worked for is finished." The manager didn't speak, but his eyes met the woman's, and for the first time, she saw something in his gaze that wasn't anger or calculation. There was a hint of resignation, of acceptance. "We were never meant to win," he said softly. "It was always a game, and we were all pawns in it." The woman stared at him, still trying to process everything. "So it's over? The game? It's finished?" "Yes," the man from her past replied. "But the truth? That's the part you'll have to live with. There's no going back now." The weight of his words hung in the air, and as the woman looked around at the people who had been part of this twisted scheme, she realized something. It wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't even about the plan they had all been caught up in. It was about the choices they had made along the way, the paths they had taken, and the consequences they now had to face. And as she turned to leave the store, the realization hit her: the game may have ended, but the lessons, those would stay with her forever. In the end, it wasn't the twists and turns of the story that mattered. It was the understanding that life was unpredictable, and sometimes, the only thing you could control was how you reacted to the chaos around you.